George and I represent the Meat Traders Association of Gauteng, and what we are aiming to do with this first foray, I suppose, into the social media world and YouTube channels and such is leverage the existing network that we have with the meat traders. The Meat Traders Association of Gauteng, as I said, which both of us represent, represents all of the employers in the meat trade in the Gauteng region. We're affiliated with the National Federation of Meat Traders, which is a national body, and effectively we are looking out for the interests of the people that sell you meat. And you know, when you go to the butchers and do your thing and choose your meat and buy what you want, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that you don't know about, and that the butchers are having to deal with on a daily basis. George is an industry veteran. He's been in the industry in various guises for many, many years, and has a huge amount of insight as to what's happening behind the scenes. And as I alluded, there's so much that's happening behind the scenes that really the consumer has no idea about. And we'll discuss a lot of these things today, but you know, current topics, you know, that are affecting the industry are things like foot and mouth disease, which has been a real issue in South Africa, and I think will continue to be so, given the state of the government veterinary system. Another hugely significant factor this year has been the avian-flu in South America, and George is intimately involved in that and can explain the knock-on effect, because you know, at the end of the day they are significant, and they affect, unfortunately, most often the poorest of the poor, who are desperately in search of cheap protein. You know, so that's significant, and a particular topic of mine that I think is being, you know, underestimated or overlooked, or is not as high on the priority list as it might be, is electricity. I think it sort of coincides with the fact that you know, we haven't had load shedding for such a long period of time. You know, so I think there's a false sense of security around that. But you know, what is of interest to me is that you know, we've had a 12.7% increase in the cost of electricity this year. Next year is 8.8, I think, and the year after that is 8.5. So those are significant above inflation increases that are being absorbed by our retailers, and you know, that's quite a lot above, as I said, it's a lot above inflation, and I'm not entirely sure all of them are, you know, paying attention to the fact that there are solutions, there are viable solutions. I mean, obviously the meat trade, the guys are using a lot of electricity. They've got fridges, freezers, you know, in some instances. So I mean, electricity consumption is a big thing, and it's something that we try and highlight for them. Other topics that, you know, we will perhaps touch on, things like quality. You know, there's a lot of misperceptions around how that all works, and ultimately how it's the onus is on the retailers, but it protects the consumers, and that relationship is important. You know, when the trust is gone, there's problems, and meat is, you know, it's I think perhaps of all the things that one buys, foodstuffs and that, meat is probably the most, I don't know what the right word would be, but intimate. You know, it's something that means a lot.
It's the center of the plate. That's
sure it is, but also I think it means a lot to South Africans across the board. You know, meat is synonymous with South Africans, and you know, so I think the importance of it all is, you know, and the quality and hygiene, all those sorts of things are key, are absolutely key, and are underestimated. But perhaps we can start off with a general intro from George, and then we can get into specifics. I think perhaps in priority list we can start with FMD, go down to the avian-flu,
and maybe consumer concerns like the cost of meat.
Cost of meat, yeah. I mean, it's before, when we were preparing for this, that is the thing that I think everyone notices. And as far as I can tell from what I've read, and stats are stats, red meat in general is up about 18% this year. And if you compare that, I mean, I'm not entirely sure about the calculations around our inflation, but our inflation is like 3.2, I think it is. 18 compared to 3.2, that's massive. And people feel it, they see it when they go to the butchery. I mean, they have to make sacrifices, I guess. So anyway, George, perhaps you can just sort of give an intro and give a little bit of background as to your journey to date in the meat industry. We discussed a lot of things before, and how much it's kind of changed over the years, from the way that the guys used to meet, and because that's, I guess, one of the big points of this whole initiative is to get with the times, and make sure that we are up to speed and are disseminating useful information via the right channels, which is not it used to be very different. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Russell. And firstly, welcome to the first episode of The Meeting Place. I think the idea behind what we're trying to achieve here is to obviously look after the interests of the butcher, manager and owner, as well as the interests of the consumer, who's obviously, as we've touched on, hit by inflation and the high cost of living, high cost of food. But at the same time, through future episodes, we'll deal with things like safe food, consumer safety, food hygiene, etc., and various other topics that might arise from time to time. This is, as Russell said, our organization is here to look after the interests of all players within the full meat value chain, from the producer through the retailer and into the consumer and onto the plate. I think if we take it, what I've seen over a number of years of being involved in this industry is that there's been evolution. From many, many years ago, we were, let's call it, an isolated country, and there was a limited amount of global trade. But today, the food supply chains of the world are very different to what they were 20 years ago. And at the same time, there's an evolution and a change in terms of how we need to be progressive to ensure that that food arrives at the right places at the right pricing. If we take it, there are 8 billion hungry mouths in the world, and those people are all almost pretty stagnant in the places where they live. If we take it, then there are production systems of food which are not necessarily where those people live. So what happens is food moves around within countries, but also across the globe, and it finds its way to those hungry mouths. What influences those movements are geopolitical things like wars, governments interfering, such as tariffs, other issues such as animal disease, and obviously also climate change and climate events which might affect production systems. But ultimately, the food that arrives on people's plates isn't necessarily produced in their own backyard, and it's about finding the right product at the right price for the consumer. So I think with that as background, maybe Russell, we can dive into some of the details.
Yeah, sure thing. The foot and mouth outbreak, I mean, I think the background is probably useful, and you probably know more of the background than what I do, but the foot and mouth situation has been in the country for quite some time, but this year it seemed to really get the attention of, get everyone's attention, given that there was a significant foot and mouth outbreak at Karen Beef in Balfour, and I think I'm correct in saying that they've got the biggest feedlot
in the world.
In the world, yeah. So there's a bit of information for everybody. The biggest feedlot in the world, and it's in Balfour, which is right near Heidelberg, in the south of Joburg. And that really, I suppose, catapulted the FMD situation, which had been bubbling under for quite some time. That catapulted it into perhaps not the front page, but the top page of News 24, let's call it, rather than the front page of the newspaper, because those aren't read that much. But there were significant knock-on effects, and there was a lot of complicated stuff and a lot of complicated issues that arose from this foot and mouth outbreak. There were others, obviously, in other feedlots nearby. I think Sparta had some issues as well. Perhaps you can go into sort of giving us a bit of background around South Africa and foot and mouth, and then obviously the specifics this year, because they had a big impact on the price of beef.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in, let's call it science and behind the virus and the movement of it, but from what we can read and see and is in the public domain and which we're aware of through the trade, is obviously that foot and mouth disease has had a major impact in terms of South Africa's beef production this year. As you said, the biggest feedlot in South Africa recently had an outbreak and they were prohibited from slaughtering for a period of time, but at the same time the disease wasn't limited. Even with their biosecurity, it managed to get into their feedlots. But foot and mouth disease has also spread across the country, and I think a month ago there were 290 odd cases that were unresolved in terms of infections across the country. Ultimately, though, even though foot and mouth disease is not dangerous to human beings, so consuming meat that comes out of a cow that might have been infected with foot and mouth disease won't affect a person, but it affects the production of beef and the ability of those animals to grow and to live good and healthy lives. So this has had an impact in terms of the available meat for the retailers, which has meant that even though there's a demand, we have 60 million people in South Africa who still need to eat every month and every day, the available beef to supply them has been limited because of these disruptions in the supply. That has meant that retailers who've wanted the meat have paid higher prices to be able to get that product into their stores. And through that, by paying higher prices, they obviously have to pass on that increased cost of the meat, and that means that your rump steak's gone from 150 Rand to maybe 220 Rand a kilogram, and stewing beef likewise from 80 Rand a kilogram to 130. Those are substantial increases which the average household can't absorb. Yeah. But what has had the effect of that further has been then that because of the increasing price of beef and the lesser availability of it, has put greater demand onto other meats such as pork and chicken, which means that those prices have also concomitantly increased in relation to where they were previously. And ultimately, the 100 Rand or 200 Rand, which the consumer has for meat in a week, in a month, means that they just buy less kilograms for that same 100 or 200 Rand which they wish to spend.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in the meat traders meetings, the guys, obviously the supply was severely strained. So there were two things I just wanted to ask you. The one was the supply was strained, so the pricing mechanism, it's obviously active and it's dynamic and it's happening all the time, but the guys were complaining about wild swings from week to week, wild swings, and how, I suppose it's a fairly transparent market. I mean, there's price discovery. How does it work?
Well, I think we need to look deeper into how the retailers are planning their supply. But at the same time, when prices go up, maybe there would be producers. They might not be feedlots, or there might be feedlots who would see that the price has increased substantially and would bring their animals to market earlier to take advantage of those higher prices. So that may create then a short-term glut, which the following week when the prices have come down, the producers hold back again, and this causes, as you say, wild swings in pricing, uncertainty about promotional activity and about affordability. So I think these types of situations and it could be other diseases in other categories of animals as well, but or of meat that we sell in South Africa. But we've got to be aware, and we've got to find and ensure that there are more robust processes in dealing with animal disease outbreaks, be it through how to monitor it, how to prevent or limit the movement of animals, because I think that the spread has been due to some reckless trading through possibly farmers who've moved animals that they suspect may have had the disease to try and get them off their farms and this kind of thing. And there's been quite a lot in terms of the media and some of those movements. And I think we're looking for responsible trade, because responsible trade ultimately will ensure that the consumer has a safe product on their shelves at an affordable price.
Yeah, the other thing that I wanted to touch on was the retailers at our most recent meetings were complaining about particularly during winter, because it sounds like it's a winter thing, but offal. Because of Karen being out of the loop for a period of time, there was a massive shortage of offal. And clearly the trade and the retailers are making money out of that.
Correct. I think the fifth quarter, as it's referred to in the trade, which is the offal, the hearts, the livers, the tripe, etc., is a very important part of many people's diets. And through the lack of slaughter, as well as through the limitation of being able to sell the fifth quarter when slaughtering was let's say, resumed, due to the fear that possibly there could be residual infection in the fifth quarter or in the offals, has meant that product couldn't come to market, and that meant that firstly the people that would traditionally or normally eat those products obviously are paying higher prices for the limited amounts available, but effectively there wasn't sufficient to meet the market demand, meaning that people couldn't necessarily get their first choice of meal.
So as part of the FMD outbreak and the protocols, you even once they were allowed to slaughter again, you're not allowed to sell the offal.
There were restrictions on certain the sale of certain of the offals, which obviously meant that the full cost of the animal had to go into the meat.
Yeah, sure. And then there's the flip side is the massive shortage of offal, which was very clear to us from the trade. The guys were, all of them were short, I was relatively unaware of how much there is in change in terms of the seasons. Like there are distinctive cuts and types of meat that are consumed in winter as opposed to summer, and this all played a part in in what the retailers are dealing with. They have such a lot to deal with. Just on the I suppose the flip side, and you alluded to it earlier, the beef shortage was positive for pork. In terms of demand.
For pork, correct, because with the expense of beef and the shortage of beef, a lot of consumers looked for cheaper meat alternatives, and pork and chicken were definitely, let's say, beneficiaries of the disaster that happened in the beef production systems, and pork prices are continuing to rise even now as we talk, and the on-shelf pricing is continuing to increase all the time, making the pork cuts, pork chops, and hams and kebabs and societies a lot more expensive than they were 2 months ago.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose people, there are obviously religious and sort of historic reasons why people haven't eaten pork, but I suppose when prices increase like they have in beef, people will make exceptions and start thinking differently. It seems like there's a bit of that bubbling under the surface.
Absolutely, and I think if we look back, every time there's a crisis in South Africa in terms of food production, and without getting into the details of listeriosis from 2016, 2017, but the biggest users of pork at that time in South Africa were the processed meat industry, and due to the fears relating to listeriosis in processed meats at the time, there was still pork production in South Africa, and that pork had to find a new market because many of the processors were not able to supply product into the trade and into the retail market. And due to that, there was a crash in the pork prices, and many people, purely from an affordability perspective, tried pork, and they've kept pork on their plates. So if we take it in 2016, 2017, the quantity of pork, or the kilograms of pork consumed per capita in South Africa, was around about 3.5 kilograms, and that's currently now 7-8 years later more than doubled to nearly 8 kilograms per person. And it was purely from a price perspective. People tried the product and they liked it, and they've continued buying it. So pork, through a crisis 7-8 years ago, has been a beneficiary of an increase in demand and consumption.
Interesting. The topic that perhaps you are the best placed, perhaps even in the country, to talk about is, and perhaps has been, or the consequences have been underestimated or misunderstood, is the avian flu outbreak, which I think it originally started in the North America and then went down into South America. I mean, it seems that it's a fairly common occurrence nowadays. It's not as infrequent as perhaps it was. But can you perhaps just talk about that, and obviously specifically Brazil, and the impact that has, and the wider impact, because obviously bringing in the product from Brazil, the MDM, and then what that's used for, what the impact is in South Africa. I mean, I remember you telling me a stat around the number of meals per day that are lost as a consequence. I mean, those are mind-boggling stats, and they impact all of our retailers massively.
Well, I think if we want to delve into that, we might need a lot longer than we've got here today. But
we've got time.
But I think if we look at it, and maybe we need to just sketch what is avian influenza, or highly pathogenic avian influenza, and what the impacts of that are on global food supply. So a number of years ago, avian influenza was considered to be a seasonal illness or a virus that infected birds. Effectively, it stunted their growth, and they didn't necessarily mature to full production level in terms of being able to be slaughtered for food and this kind of thing. It started off in, I think, Europe and in the East, in those countries. And a number of years ago, 15, 20 years ago, it wasn't seen as being a major item. Obviously, it was seen as major in those production systems. But over time now, and a number of years, highly pathogenic avian influenza has become endemic across the globe. So it spread eventually to North America, and in the last 2 or 3 years it's gone into South America. Argentina and Chile were first infected in South America, but Brazil wasn't infected.
It's not only domesticated birds.
No, it affects and is spread through wild birds, and normally at the change of seasons, so when the migrating birds move between continents and between northern and southern hemisphere, that's when the spread is most virulent. But what has happened is we've seen, especially in North America in the last 2 years, that it's not only limited to the change in season, it's now become through mutation throughout the year that there are infections across the globe. But it's only in the last year that it's now become endemic across the globe, with infections in South America and in May this year in Brazil. So why is this important? And I think what's important to understand here is, as we touched on earlier, there's a global production system for animal proteins, so that's poultry, for beef, for pork, etc. If we take it only recently in the last 3 or 4 years, has poultry or chicken become the most consumed animal protein across the world. Before that, it was pork,
How long ago?
only in the last 2 to 3 years.
Wow.
So before that, pork was the most consumed global protein, even though in South Africa it was relatively small, but from a global perspective, it was the most consumed protein. Chicken has now caught up with that due to a number of reasons. It's easier to produce, it's got a shorter lifespan to produce, as well as it's more affordable because it's cheaper to actually get to the end product than it is any other form of animal protein.
In terms of
the cost
the cost of effectively feed, what's it going to produce in terms of meat, that cost.
Correct, yes. So
it's
effectively
basically the transformation of like
a day-old chick, let's call it,
into
with
meat.
feed and
Yeah.
getting into
Okay.
the end product of meat.
and chicken's the cheapest.
It's the cheapest, and it's now, as I said, become the most consumed animal meat globally. Brazil and US are the biggest suppliers to the world. They're the biggest producers. They're also the biggest consumers of chicken meat. But at the same time, they are also now, between the two of them, the biggest exporters to the world. South Africa imports poultry from Brazil, even with high import duties, and I think we'll keep the duties and the structures for a future episode, but just to give the listener and the viewer an idea, you know, we are sitting with on bone-in chicken 62% duties, which is absolutely criminal in an environment of a basic foodstuffs, but we'll deal with that in future discussions. But if we take it, South Africa imports from Brazil about 500,000 tons of chicken meat a year, of which about 250,000 tons of that is MDM. MDM is a chicken mince that is used in the manufacture of things like polonies and Viennas and Russian sausages. So that's a very big part of the consumer base.
It's a chicken mince.
It's a chicken mince. Effectively, what you have is a chicken, you grow a chicken, and very little trade in the world, and even in South Africa, very few people buy a whole chicken. Maybe someone will go to Woolworths on the weekend and buy a chicken for a Sunday roast. But is a family eating a roast chicken for a Wednesday night meal? No, they'll be eating a chicken burger or something, or chicken drumstick and this kind of thing. So the majority of trade takes place in the portions or the parts of the chicken, and every consumer views a different part with a different value. So for someone, their family might prefer things like the legs, so the drumstick and thigh. Other families may prefer things like the breast, which is the white meat of the chicken. Others, if you go to KFC, for argument's sake, wings are, and in food service, wings are a very, very popular cut there. So a chicken mustn't be seen as a chicken must be seen as the cuts
parts.
or the parts that come off it. And if we take that, once you've grown a chicken, in all global production systems, the chicken is cut up into parts. And each part will find its way to that element of the market that will pay the most for it. Then what's left is effectively the bones and some of the meat that's left on the bones, and that through a mechanical process is removed from the bones and turned into a chicken mince, which is then used as a very nutritious raw material for the manufacture of processed meats. And we can touch on that, and that's almost also a whole discussion on its own, but we'll touch on that shortly. So if we take 250,000 tons of the imports into South Africa from Brazil.
250,000 tons.
Yeah, 250 million kilos, yes. And we'll get into what that means in terms of meals shortly, but then there's also chicken cuts, so there'll be some chicken leg quarters, some chicken thighs, for argument's sake, chicken wings, and then a lot of chicken offals again. We touched on offals and the beef offals earlier, but things like chicken necks and chicken feet, which are brought in to supplement. It's not to be seen as competition to local production, to supplement and add to local chicken production where there's a shortage of those cuts to meet the consumer demand. And it's feeding the poorer let's say consumer in South Africa and the poorer families. So those families and those households which are looking for price competitive and affordable foodstuffs and nutritious foodstuffs are looking for alternatives. Not everyone can afford a chicken breast to put on their plate, but a chicken neck in a stew or chicken feet in a stew feeds many households, and it's sometimes the only access to animal protein that they get. So with the bird flu outbreak in Brazil in May this year, and this was now in context of being on top of the foot and mouth disease that we were talking about locally. It was absolutely a perfect storm in terms of supply. There was a guillotine that effectively all exports of poultry from Brazil were cut off like a guillotine, and that product that was on the water that met the dates of production could still come in, but there were no new exports out of Brazil. So if we take just the volume of poultry out of Brazil, and you asked earlier about how many meals that equated to, if we take the things like the chicken livers, chicken necks, the chicken feet, the chicken leg quarters, which is a part of the basket, and then you add to that the chicken mince that is brought in for processing, that equates to just over 100 million meals per month that it supplies South Africans. So if we look at it,
100 million meals per month, that is
nearly 2 meals
repeating repeatedly.
Nearly 2 meals for every South African every month is just from the poultry meat that is imported from Brazil. And that is cut off like a guillotine due to the bird flu infection in Brazil. Now, that infection in Brazil was limited to one infection that was in commercial poultry, and it was in one state. Now, Brazil is a monster country, massive country, producing huge volumes of chicken, and it was one state. That state produces probably about 12 to 15% of the total production of poultry in Brazil. So it's quite large within the Brazil context, but it isn't the Brazil, let's say, breadbasket. It is part of the breadbasket of Brazil in terms of animal meat production.
Are our imports pretty consistent? Is there seasonality to them?
No, there's very little seasonality. Okay. What historically has affected the imports has purely been the import duties. Okay. But this is the first time that Brazil has had the interruption of an animal disease outbreak like this. Previously, there have been statewide bans for things like Newcastle disease, which is also endemic in South Africa, but where we have very strict import restrictions. But this is the first time that Brazil as a country was cut off, even though the infection was isolated to one state in Brazil.
Were they cut off from everywhere?
From many parts of the world. So most parts of the world that hadn't yet, and this is going to get into a very important part of how do we get food safety and food security in terms of supply chains resolved for the future. But certain countries had agreed regionalization or zoning protocols. South Africa has not yet, and we're still at risk if there's a future outbreak of bird flu in Brazil of having a total ban on Brazil again.
So we just take a blanket approach. Our Department of Agriculture will look at it and say, all right, Brazil is, all of the country is blanketed, irrespective of where the outbreak comes from, and sort of proactive measures other countries have taken in terms of saying, well, let's rather be pragmatic about this and let's ban that state. We
Correct.
Just go...
Well, they're very strong protocols and world-acknowledged protocols in terms of how to deal with animal disease outbreaks under the World Organization for Animal Health. That used to be known as the OIE. It's hosted in France, and most countries across the globe, including South Africa, are members of the World Organization for Animal Health, and there they adopt codes of good practice for various animal diseases, etc. And there's this very clear code in terms of how to deal with, let's say, infections, and how to deal with zoning and regionalization in terms of animal diseases. So foot and mouth disease has a code, PRRS, which is pork disease, has a code, Newcastle disease has a code, avian influenza, which we're talking about, has a code. And in there it talks about having protection zones, and generally those are within 10-kilometer radius around an outbreak, and therefore areas under surveillance where there aren't further infections after an initial outbreak are considered free, and trade free and safe trade should be able to resume.
Trying to balance things.
Correct. And most of the world has acknowledged and has put zoning and regionalisation protocols in place with their trade partners. South Africa's adopted and understands this because we have a very similar process. It's at state level, but with the United States of America. So we have a situation of zoning and regionalisation for bird flu in the USA, but we haven't yet acknowledged and agreed a similar protocol with Brazil, which means with Brazil as our biggest supplier of poultry to South Africa, which is an exceptionally important product to supplement and to local production and to feed the nation, we're at huge risk of, if there's a future outbreak of bird flu in Brazil. This last outbreak resulted in severe shortages of raw materials, severe shortages of those products that come from Brazil, like chicken feet and chicken necks, and that saw local prices, because of the local production can't meet the demand, increasing by up to nearly 100% on certain of those items. Like chicken necks, for argument's sake, at the wholesale level, and that feeds on in terms of retail pricing at the retail level. And processed meats which include Viennas, Polonies, Russians, etc., cooked sausages, produce probably just under 100 million meals using that chicken mince a month for South Africans. And many factories came to a standstill. Many factories had to go into short production and put surcharges on their pricing because there was not enough available raw material to allow them to continue producing the volumes that they produce to feed the South African population. So this crisis, if it had lasted longer, would have resulted in job losses in the processing sector, and would have meant that many processed meats would have actually not been available to put on the retailers' shelves, and that's a big problem and a big crisis, and we need to urgently, as a country, consider agreeing a regionalisation protocol with Brazil to prevent another crisis like we've just gone through, and which we are still feeling the effects of, because the supply chain is still not filled after that ban. So the ban was lifted in the middle of August, but it takes a while for the chain to get filled, because it was empty of those products, and it's still going to take another probably month or two for full supply to resume.
So to use a cricketing analogy, the government is clearly not walking in with the bowler.
At this point, no. And I think that we have acknowledged, and we do know what needs to be done. But I think we need to now man up, and we need to actually put those protocols into place. Unfortunately, I think the department that deals with this has had many crises to deal with, including our own foot and mouth disease, including our own avian influenza in South Africa. And we mustn't believe South Africa is free of avian influenza. There have been two fairly substantial infections locally, which has affected our own supply, which is impacting the market right now, and will continue to impact the supply in South Africa of local chicken right through into the new year, which means that not all producers are able to actually produce at full capacity at the moment.
And protocol there is you've got to destroy where you find infected birds. You've got to destroy the whole lot.
You cull out the infected flocks, and then you have to rebuild them. So if you take the infection, if it's in the genetics and genetic line, which is the layers, so if you think of it in a family dynamic, you have those that produce the eggs to produce the day-old chicks, which then land up as chicken on our table. But you also have the egg production system, and you have eggs that are produced through layers, which produce eggs, and they're two different production systems. So if it gets into your genetic, which is your parent flocks, which is the genetic royalty, if you want to call it, that needs to be protected, and you cull that out, it takes nearly 2 years to rebuild that.
Okay.
If it happens in a broiler house, which is broilers, the table chicken, that's within 2 months can be replaced.
Yeah.
It depends at what level the infection takes place.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of nuance and lots of detail and lots of complexity to all these things, and hopefully, the point of this is to get, our retailers, our butchers, to understand what is happening behind the scenes, because I think a lot of them, it just lands on their desks and the guys are stressed, they're dealing with a million different things at once, and this is just another challenge. But hopefully understanding what is happening in the background and why will be helpful to the guys. So just in terms of that, how would the ban and the subsequent shortage, how would it have impacted, let's say, ABC, one of the butchers that we know on a corner in a busy, bustling, area of Johannesburg? How would it have impacted them in a practical sense from sort of May to now?
Well, firstly, what would have happened, and we must realize, I think, that most butchers that you're talking to, ABC Butcher, is their primary product is selling local, fresh South African beef.
Yeah.
They will also sell a portion of local South African chicken,
sure.
To a lesser extent some local South African pork, but they supplement all of those in terms of what their customer demands of them with imported products. And those imported products could be certain pork cuts, could be certain beef offals like beef livers, etc. But also a big part of what goes into those types of retail stores is imported chicken, so chicken feet, chicken necks, etc. And they also will be using and selling a large component of, whether it's in-store produced or bought out, things like smoked and cooked sausages like Russians, Viennas and Polonies. So what would have happened in terms of the typical retailer you're referring to there, firstly they would have had supply shocks in their local beef supply. They would have been supplementing that local beef supply with additional imported chicken and local chicken to be able to ensure that their shelves stayed full and they had a full offering to offer their customers. With the lack of imported chicken, they would have bought more local chicken, which wasn't available to meet the full demand, which meant the price went up. There was also, because of the increased demand on a lesser supply of imported product, the imported product went price, so their price went up. So ultimately what this resulted in was that all of the shelf prices of every single product and cut increased dramatically for that consumer. And that consumer doesn't always have additional disposable income to be able to afford the price and absorb the price increases. So that retailer would have now been firstly suffering in terms of not enough available product. They would have had to push up their prices because they had to pay higher prices for the available product. And over a period of the next 2 to 3 months, if you take it from May into August and into the end of August, they would have found that many of the items that they would normally want to buy in stock for their customer was no longer available, which meant they had a limited offering on limited available product at very high prices. And all of those things ultimately mean that you have an issue where your rent hasn't gone down, like the volumes have gone down, electricity's gone up, you still have to pay your staff, etc. And the overheads of running your business. The rental didn't go away. So ultimately it was a crisis period for many, many retailers, and ultimately that moved on to being a very, very tough period for many consumers who shopped at those shops. And they would have been moving either into alternative types of food, probably not animal protein, and maybe soya. They were removing possibly soya, but in many instances they were moving possibly into soups and noodles type of products, and they were actually removing meat, critical animal protein, which has nutrients and is exceptionally important for human health, for development of especially young people, young minds, and this kind of thing. So ultimately, it was, if it had continued longer, it was a crisis brewing.
I mean, based on some of the conversations that we've had at meetings, some of the retailers would suggest that they're unable to always pass on the increases, particularly in a market that is pretty dynamic, like we've seen for most of the year, as a consequence of these issues that were happening. So they were unable to pass on. They were effectively absorbing some of the increase, which is another, it's another issue for them. The consumers, they know, I think they get a sense and get a feel for, where the consumer's at, and therefore have had to, absorb some of this. Yeah, it's been a tough time for retailers, 2025, for all the reasons that we've mentioned. Yeah.
Well, I think if we have to try and unpack that, that we've got a very high unemployment rate in the country, and there's approximately 20 billion rand a month of social security in some form or another that's paid out to those people that are destitute, unemployed, the basic income grant, etc. And that 20 billion rand is 20 billion rand, and some of those grants are, I think they're 380 or 400 rand a month. And if that's what you've got, and there are 2 or 3 of those in a family, and that's being pooled to buy food, so you're going to buy starch, you're going to try and buy some meat. Unfortunately, airtime sometimes take priority over some of the real necessities and basics, etc. But those few grants is still only that amount of money. So if there's a household that has 1,500 rand to spend, and your meat component was 200 or 250 rand of that, if the prices go up, you don't say, well, I'm taking away from some of my other spend, because there is no discretionary spend. You're already surviving below, and it's surviving below the food line or the poverty line. And that 250 rand is now, instead of buying you maybe 5 or 6 kilograms of product, meat product a month, you're now only buying 3 or maybe 4 kilograms a month. So you've lost 20 or 30% of the meats that you would have put onto your family's table through the month. And that's how crisis and dire it is. So that retailer you're talking about has to pass on some of the pricing, but his customer can't absorb the pricing. And especially if you have a limited range of products, which is meat-based, especially retail butchers that aren't part of a larger supermarket base, they were under severe pressure and would have felt the crunch through this time. And for those that have survived, well done to them, because I don't think it's been easy for any retailer.
No, of course not. And I was just thinking what you said there. So you've got a limited product offering, which potentially is going to impact your top line.
Absolutely, it impacts your top line and your
cost base
margin.
is staying. Well, it's not staying the same. I mean, it's increasing. I mean, 12.7% from Eskom.
In the middle of that, correct?
Yeah,
in July.
and it's not off a low base. That's the thing. 12.7 of one is, but 12.7 of a decent number is a significant increase to that line, your electricity line, and your P&L. Perhaps that's something we can just touch on. I mean, it's definitely something that we've been trying to make our members aware of, because we kind of got a sense that there was a lot of this stuff coming down the pipeline. But given all of the shocks that we all endured from load shedding, I think certainly the South African renewables landscape has changed massively in terms of how much stuff is done with solar, homes, etc., and the price obviously came down. And I think a lot of us have been lulled into a false sense of security around the fact that we haven't had load shedding for how long? Nearly 2 years.
Well, no, for load shedding in its current form has been about 4 or 5 months, but prior to that,
we had a few skirmishes
earlier in this year, sort of in February to April.
But the really hectic load shedding that we all endured in, what was it, 23. So it feels to me like 24 and 25 have been largely load shedding free, but behind all of that is these increases that are getting passed on. And if you believe what you read in the press, it's an existential imperative for Eskom to be able to increase the prices to the extent that they are. I mean, they asked for much higher prices when they went to NERSA. I think they were asking for, over a 3-year period, around 50%. They ended up with 12.7 plus 8.5 plus 8.5, 17. So they got nearly 30 over the next 3 years. And I just think, from a retailer's point of view, having a solution. I don't know what the landscape looks like regarding whether we will get more load shedding. I understand that Eskom has done a lot of good work in terms of improving efficiency and so on, but I don't know, who knows. But I think from a cost point of view, having a solution that involves some solar and batteries and such, it must be an imperative. And then also going and looking, and I know there are businesses out there that are all around focusing all their attention really on energy optimization. So looking at what, for example, what appliances, what equipment you have in a butchery, and installing smart switches that are turning things on and off as in if they're able to, and really having a look at. I've come to understand that it's quite complicated. The kind of power you're using, when you're using it, coinciding all of that with your solar. There's a hell of a lot that can be done. For each and every retailer out there, that will make a difference to their P&L, of course. Absolutely.
Well, absolutely. I think electricity is critical to running any butchery operation. You've got refrigeration to store your raw materials and your product before you prepare it. You then have mincing machines and bandsaws, which are all energy intensive units. They're very hungry. Obviously, modern technology, if you can afford to replace and you're buying new equipment, it might be more energy efficient. But then again, it's a foodstuff that requires refrigeration, and you don't want to have a break in refrigeration because that can cause spoilage. And then obviously the product that's on display to the consumer is in a refrigerated let's say environment to ensure that it's in optimal condition before the consumer buys it. So we don't want to see that retailers are taking shortcuts or not able to maintain the cold chain, because that can create further problems down the line, which in terms of food safety, which we don't want to be seeing.
Yeah. I mean, I would imagine the refrigeration component's also very power hungry.
Very much so.
Yeah, I mean, it's not blast freezers, but I mean, you guys operate those sort of things.
No, we don't in our business have blast freezers, but we do have large freezers. We've got 12,500 pallets of frozen warehousing capacity, and I don't have all the technical volumes or requirements, but it's very energy hungry to be able to maintain adequate refrigeration to keep the product stored at optimal temperatures to ensure that it doesn't spoil before it goes to the retailer or into a factory. So,
what are you keeping those 12,000 pallets at, temperature-wise?
The product needs to be stored at minus 18 degrees or colder. So we run our refrigeration at minus 18 degrees.
And just for clarification, a blast freezer is when it goes through the process of making it frozen.
Correct. So a blast freezer would be where you take a chilled or a fresh product, which would generally be, let's say, handled at probably between +2 to +10 degrees Celsius, and you want to take it and freeze it as quickly as possible, and normally that process would be between 24 and 36 hours to get it to minus 18 degrees at its core temperature. So those types of refrigeration units are very energy, let's say, intensive to be able to draw down that temperature within that period of time. And thereafter you can move it into, let's say, a holding facility which would hold it at those temperatures.
Does Bo do that?
No, he doesn't. He outsources that.
But in Stainsburg, do they freeze?
No, not in their own facility.
No, they chill it.
Yes, correct.
Okay. And then he brings it to be frozen?
Correct. He uses outside contractors to do that.
Okay. Is there, what were the other topics that we were going to touch on? Is there anything that springs to mind for you?
I think the meeting place has opened up our conversation for today, and I think as we get feedback and we talk to more people within, let's call it, that are butchery owners, we'll find topics that are of interest or where they would like to have further discussions. I think that there are many areas which will be of interest to business owners, to people who work within retail butchers, as well as to consumers. And I think to ensure that the consumer understands that they are ultimately the recipients of responsible retailers who are doing a good job to ensure that they are getting safe, nutritious and affordable meats. Yeah,
no, I agree with you completely. I think that, this is step one, I suppose. We want to get out there. We want to appeal to our retailers, across the board. As we discussed earlier, a lot of the retailers that we encounter are younger and have grown up with smartphones, and the way that they consume information now is, via TikTok, via Instagram, to some extent, I think YouTube. And obviously YouTube's a bit more long form, but I think it's time that we provide them the avenues that they want to get and consume, hopefully relevant, and we'll make sure that we, getting relevant and interesting people to come and share their views and ideas. I think first prize in some instances is always a meeting, the in-person opportunity to sit down, greet each other, have a discussion, and, kind of see the other side, see the other person in the flesh would be first choice, but, that's not the way the world is these days. So, without being able to get 300 of our members and retailers in a room and, share time with them, I think this is perhaps the next best thing. I think we will still continue to try and make sure that people come to our meetings. They always are good, and we are trying to accommodate everybody just in terms of the time of day that we have them. But like I say, there's something pretty cool about being in the same room with a bunch of people who have, are feeling the same pain, and having robust discussions and talking about things and finding out all the little nuances that are happening in their sort of corner of the industry. So hopefully this will be supplementary to that, and let's see how it grows. I mean, I don't think anyone, including Joe Rogan, when they first started, what they were doing with their first podcast, I don't think anyone ever quite knows where it's going to go, and what impact it's going to have. But I think today is significant because it's a first step. And yeah, thanks for your time, and thanks for all of your all of the positive sort of sentiment that you've had around this concept. So yeah, thanks, George. George. Thank you.
Thank you,
and thanks,
Russell.
guys.
I think
thanks for everything.
Sorry, I think the time of and there's a time and place for the big auditoriums.
Yeah.
I think there's a time and place for committees to give guidance and to be able to also do some of the work, do some of the engagement, and bring concerns of the broader industry to the table. And any organization, any association needs people to get involved, and I think we'd invite anyone to contact the association who believes they've got something to offer.
Yeah.
But at the same time, this is a manner in which we can share information and get to everyone who doesn't necessarily have the time or the ability to join a physical meeting.
Sure.
And for them to be able to see what is being done on their behalf, and to ensure that we're looking to grow the retail meat sector in South Africa and allow them to thrive in very tough circumstances. So thank you, Russell.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we just want them to know that, you know, we're on their side. Whatever that means and whatever we can do, I say that all the time, whatever we can do to help. It's been tough out there, and you know, there will be challenges down the line, and you know, hopefully we can run ahead of some of them and provide solutions, provide information, provide answers. I mean, sometimes all it is information. You know, if you can provide that, you know, you can give people, you know, half a chance to get ahead of it. This has been cool. I've actually enjoyed it a lot.